At 7:32 on April 17, 1944, over a strip of wet grass outside the village of Langenfeld in Lower Saxony, an American Mustang eased its nose down, wheels sinking into the mud, and came to rest like a tired animal. Lieutenant Robert Hayes unclipped his harness and sat with his hands on the stick for a long breath, listening to the lingering cough of the Merlin engine as if it were someone dying in the next room. The morning smelled of diesel and damp straw. He could hear distant voices and the soft clank of a nearby cart. Hayes had flown combat for months and knew how thin the line was between control and surrender. Here that line had thinned to a strip of sod and a single decision to cut his throttle and go down. Minutes later, uniforms arrived. Gloved hands checked the cockpit. A map fell into the mud, and the Mustang that had been an instrument of protection for his unit became a subject of intense curiosity for a people who had not expected such a gift. Within hours, the aircraft would be tagged catalog number 44G217 and pushed onto a flatbed bound for an intelligence depot. Within days, it would be in the hands of a test pilot whose report would unsettle doctrines on both sides of the war. This is a story of mettle and method, of throttle settings and triangulated diagrams, and of a revelation about defensive systems that would force commanders to rethink what they could risk. We will meet pilots and engineers, read reconstructed flight reports, and examine numbers that explain why a machine designed to escort bombers could be more fragile than it looked. The stakes reach beyond the fate of one man. They touch the corridor of command where strategy is folded from facts and fear. The engine quit at 0728, short and abrupt. A drop in oil pressure followed by a shallow cough and then silence. Hayes remembered the smell of hot oil and the metallic tang of fuel as his Merlin sputtered, and the sound of the airframe rattling as cooling flaps struggled to readjust. He pushed the throttle fully back and felt the stick lighten under his palms. Radio crackle was gone. Below there were fields, a thin road, a hedge line, and 3 barns. He chose the field. His choice was surgical and resigned. On the ground, the first to reach him were farmers and a local feldgendarme. Hans pulled him from the cockpit with rough efficiency. A soldier named Ernst Vogel took his helmet and, after a grave look into the pilot's face, asked in careful English where he had been shot down. Hayes answered in a voice that still shook, "Escort run. Engine gave up." The soldier answered with a phrase that would be translated in reports, "You are lucky to survive this crash." That luck was complicated. The Mustang was not a lost trophy to be blown apart, but an object of strategic intelligence. Otto Keller, the mechanic, would later describe the scene at the depot, how he smelled the residual castor and gasoline even after the tanks had been drained, and how he felt the cold of bare metal that had been too long in the wind. In the hours after capture, the Mustang was examined and prepared for transit with procedural care that revealed as much about the captors as it did about the captured plane. Men in gray uniforms labeled components, drained the radiators, sealed instruments, and wrapped the propeller in burlap. There was a quiet urgency in their work, a clink and whisper of tools, the smell of solvent and leather, and the rust-colored smear of dried hydraulic fluid in the wheel wells. One of the soldiers, Corporal Dieter Baum, kept scanning the sky, listening with an almost religious intensity for the sound of Allied engines, as if the air itself might carry rescue. The crate that would carry the Mustang was loaded onto a wagon, the wheels grinding the road, and the plane was positioned with the care of someone placing an unusual vase in a vault. Hayes watched from the back of a truck, wrists bound, as the aircraft disappeared toward a railhead where higher orders would decide its fate. He felt a loneliness that had nothing to do with captivity, and everything to do with being the hinge that had opened a door no one had planned to open. At the intelligence depot, the process moved from physical to bureaucratic. Lieutenant Friedrich Adler of the Air Intelligence Corps logged serials and made an initial assessment. He noticed a detail in the panel near the gun sight that made him pause. "This is not exactly like the reports," he told the attending officer Emil Bauer, the engineer, as rain smudged the ink on the logbook. Bauer, whose hands smelled of grease and who had a habit of removing his cap before inspecting anything, leaned in and muttered the word Merlin with a blend of reverence and curiosity. The label Packard was visible on part of the engine, and Adler scribbled that down too. The intelligence office hummed, closed and secretive, with the odor of paper and cigarette smoke. A dispatch was sent to the test center at Marienborn, and a train was requisitioned. The plane, now catalogued and padlocked for transport, crawled across the rails like a prisoner. It was at Marienborn, on the outskirts of Braunschweig, that the Mustang entered the world of assessments and hypotheses. The base itself was older than the current war, a compact town of hangars, workshops, briefing rooms, and a runway that gleamed when the rain came. Its walls smelled of oil and old paint, and when sunlight found the panes, it threw slats of golden light across diagrams pinned to corkboards. Colonel Wilhelm Kruger commanded operations there. He was exacting and conservative, a man who favored forms and highlighted numbers over gut feelings. He assigned Hauptmann Hans Lurch to the case. Lurch was 42, a pilot with a past in test flying and a reputation for seeing what others missed. He walked with a slight limp from a landing 2 years earlier, and his eyes held the neatness of someone cataloging everything he observed. He smoked thin cigarettes and could quote weeks of instrumentation readings from memory. Lurch was the man the base turned to when a strange machine arrived that required an opinion that carried weight. Lurch's life before the Mustang explained why this test mattered. He had grown up near Stuttgart in a house where his mother ran a bakery and his father tinkered with early petrol motors. As a boy, he learned to distinguish the timbre of different engines by ear, and he built model aircraft with obsessively balanced props. He enlisted in the air service at 19 and survived a crash that took the use of one ankle and left him with a misunderstanding from some who called him reckless. In his 30s, he transferred to a test group, his hands developing a sensitivity for torque and vibration that some pilots called instinct. He had lost a brother in the Eastern Front and had a steady grief he kept folded under professional calm. Presently, he flew prototypes and evaluated captured types. He was the kind of man who could see the structural compromise in a wing by touching the skin with gloved fingers. That backstory shaped how he would approach the Mustang, not as a symbol, but as a system of tolerances and trade-offs. The team assembled around the aircraft at Marienborn included Otto Keller, the mechanic who had helped unload the Mustang from the train, Emil Bauer, the structural engineer who favored technical diagrams and the sound of calipers, Dr. Anna Weiss, the aerodynamicist who studied airflow and smoke tunnels, Captain Reinhardt from intelligence, whose notebook was full of intercept codes, Ingrid Meyer, the interpreter, tasked with questioning captured aircrew, and Karl Vogel, the ground crew chief responsible for engine systems. Each had a role that would be clear in the days to come. Bergman, the armorer, took note of the ammunition feed and gun synchronizer, while Lieutenant Hans Bauer served as the liaison to headquarters. There was also an American prisoner whose name was private in the initial reports, but who would be referred to in internal logs as Subject Hayes. The presence of these characters created a network of expertise that turned a damaged airplane into a laboratory on wheels. The first formal inspection was thorough and almost surgical. Keller removed access panels to expose the Packard Merlin, a V-12 liquid-cooled engine with a reputation among engineers everywhere for high specific power. There was an oil smell, the metallic rasp of bearings, and a cool antiseptic odor from solvents. Bauer measured compression on pistons, while Weiss examined the radiator cowlings and the characteristic Meredith effect that influenced the aircraft's cooling drag. She ran her gloved hand across the wing and found evidence of minor surface corrosion in the flat bays. The fuel pump had a small clog that matched Hayes' testimony about a momentary drop in manifold pressure. If the fuel metering diaphragm collapsed under -G, it could explain a stumble, Bauer explained in a low voice while his assistant scribbled numbers into a flight report notebook. Technical notes accumulated. Rate of climb figures extrapolated from prop pitch. Aileron balance noted in grams with trim tabs labeled. Flap actuation revealed to be hydraulic with a backup mechanical linkage. And the oil cooler's baffling found to be intact. Each procedural step was documented with a precision that made Hayes's earlier decision look inevitable and the plane's survival improbable. The test pilot briefings and early dialogues were dense with exchanges. In the hangar, Lurch walked around the Mustang with Keller at his shoulder and Emil Bauer at his back. "How tight is the control linkage around the aileron?" Lurch asked. "There is minor play," Keller answered. "Half a millimeter, but consistent with field repairs," Bauer said. "What about the radiators?" Lurch asked. "They are Packard installed with the Meredith flap intact, but the lower intake shows a dent," said Weiss. "Could that reduce cooling?" Lurch asked. "It changes the boundary layer and increases local drag, but not catastrophic," Weiss replied. "Fuel line contamination?" Lurch asked. "Possible from a recent filter change," Keller said. "Throttle quadrant will need recalibration," Bauer added. "We run a ground spin of the prop and check manifold increment," Lurch ordered. "Do you think the engine can be restarted safely?" Reinhardt asked. "With new filters and a static prime, yes," Lurch answered. "I want a complete checklist and a reconnection of the oil pressure sensor," Vogel said. "Time frame?" Kruger asked. 48 hours to static taxi tests," Lurch said. The dialogue stretched in precise technical turns, and each line carried the weight of possible outcomes. The first engine run was a confined, tense procedure. The hangar smelled of fresh petrol and burning clutches as the prop made a hesitant revolution. The sound of the Merlin warming was a low growl that raised hairs on arms. Instruments rattled, and a small stream of condensation leaked from the exhaust stack. Keller turned the mixture, and Lurch listened with a hand on his jaw, counting each cycle like a metronome. "Oil pressure 15 psi, rising to 30 at idle," the mechanic reported. "Manifold pressure steady," Emil said. "Temp gradient across the radiator is odd," Dr. Weiss observed, pointing with a gloved fingertip at the thermocouple readout. Lurch nodded. "We will not fly without correcting the meter and refilling with the specified grade," he said. The plane rolled out for a short taxi, with the ground crew listening to propulsion harmonics. The smell of hot brakes and tar thick in the cold air. Wheels scraped, flaps whispered, and the canopy hummed with minor leaks. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and threatening. The first actual flight test was the hinge moment. Lurch climbed into the cockpit, the leather warm beneath his palm, and the smell of old oil and sealant combined with the faint, sickly sweetness of windshield cleaner. He wrapped the harness and clicked comms into place. The hangar door retracted, and the runway offered itself like a strip of slate to be read. The engine breathed, the Mustang leapt forward, and the ground blurred into the smell of crushed grass and the taste of adrenaline. Hans spoke over the headset in short, clipped exchanges with his ground engineer. "Throttle 25 inches," he called. "Stable," Keller answered. "Climb at 800 feet per minute?" Lurch asked. "Expect 2,500 at sea level on normal boost," Bauer reported. "We will log altitude, airspeed, and control harmony," Weiss said. "Report any yaw or roll with numbers," Reinhardt cautioned. The cockpit filled with a mixture of wind noise and instrument ticking. The pilot felt the pressure changes on his face and the vibration of the prop through the stick. He noticed a small metallic taste in his mouth during aggressive rolls, the result of exertion and closed oxygen lines. Visibility through the canopy was clear, but for a smear on the lower right that caught sun in reflecting glints. In the air, the Mustang demonstrated a performance envelope that combined power with nuanced weaknesses. Lurch pushed into a shallow climb and watched the vertical speed indicator needle swing. The rate of climb reached matched predicted numbers at 3,000 feet, 250 meters per minute, though with a heavier control feel than the manuals suggested. Speed trials followed. At full throttle and war emergency boost, the plane hit 437 miles per hour at 15,000 feet, approximately 703 kilometers per hour, a figure that drew an appreciative murmur in the cockpit and later in the report. Banked rolls revealed a crisp aileron response, but a tendency for slight yaw at high angular velocities. Lurch initiated a rapid descent and practiced a recovery from an accelerated stall. The Mustang responded predictably, but the control input needed more force than comparable aircraft like the Focke-Wulf 190. The aileron balancing required heavier trim, and the radiator system created a noticeable drag penalty at higher angles of attack. Lurch could feel pressure differentials along his palms as the air flowed, and he described a faint vibration in the rudder pedals between 480 and 520 miles per hour that corresponded with minor buffeting from the gun bay. Conversations during the test were long and technical, stretching into a pattern that would be quoted in internal minutes. "You got the roll rate at 60 degrees?" Bauer asked. "I recorded 3.6 seconds for a full roll at combat loading," Lurch said. "That is slower than ideal for a point defense fighter," Reinhardt noted. "But the Mustang has range and high speed and level flight," Weiss replied. "Its fuel capacity and laminar flow wings reduce drag at high altitude." "Does the radiator flap vulnerabilities?" Lurch asked. "It can be targeted. A puncture increases drag and will raise coolant temperatures quickly," Keller answered. "If the oil cooler is hit, you lose pressure fast," Vogel said. "Interruption to fuel pressure under -G remains a concern," Lurch remarked. "The Packard Merlin has a high power-to-weight ratio," Bauer added, "but it relies on careful fuel metering and maintenance." "In short," Reinhardt said, "it is fast and it is fragile in certain attack profiles." 3 moments during the test stood out, and each slowed time into a focused narrative. The first occurred when Lurch intentionally simulated a partial engine failure during a climb. He closed the throttle rapidly and leaned the mixture, and for an instant the Merlin hit an odd vibration that felt like a hand striking the fuselage. The noise of compartmental fittings came forward like a chorus. Lurch struggled with throttle response and felt the aircraft swing like a pendulum. It took him 20 precious seconds to stabilize the engine and return to normal boost. The second moment of tension came when he executed a mock interception against the base's escort. The Mustang, when pushed into repeated high-G turns to simulate dogfighting with a 190, showed increased oil temperatures and slight control stiffening. The third occurred when a minor fuel feed bubble formed in the line after prolonged -G maneuvers. The engine cleared with a practiced twist of mixture and boost, but the incident proved that in certain aggressive defensive maneuvers, the Mustang could experience ruptures in continuous power supply. Each of these scenarios lasted long enough to be described with sensations: the taste of copper, the metallic smell from overheated fittings, hands damp on the wheel, and the thump of a heart counting too fast. After the flight, Lurch and the team debriefed in a room where the smell of stale coffee mixed with ink. They argued in a sequence of exchanges that became the core of the internal report. "The Mustang can outrun most fighters in level flight," Lurch said. "It can outclimb many at medium altitudes," Weiss replied. "But its defensive envelope, when asked to perform continuous high-G defensive moves, is limited by cooling and fuel metering vulnerabilities," Bauer stated. "That means in an escort role, where it must turn back and engage repeatedly with enemy fighters, the risk rises." Reinhardt put it plainly. "Its defenses are excellent if it dictates terms. In sustained close-in combat, its systems can be exposed." They compiled diagrams with annotated rates of climb, drag coefficients, and a clear recommendation that escort doctrine should not gamble on repeated defensive dogfights beyond certain altitudes. The flight report included a calibrated table of speeds, altitudes, climb rates, and recommended engagement envelopes. It also included the quote later circulated privately in command circles: "Technically superior in sprint, technically fragile in endurance. The dissemination of Lurch's report triggered debates and demonstrations. Colonel Kruger arranged a controlled demonstration for senior officers. The hangar filled with the smell of polished aluminum and nervous sweat. Officers in different uniforms compared notes and watched instrument panels under the halogen lights. Lurch ran through the Mustang's response in a recorded sequence while Bauer and Weiss displayed diagrams on a portable easel. The practical demonstration was damning in its clarity. A comparative exercise placed a captured Mustang against a Messerschmitt Bf-109 in simulated interception profiles. The Bf-109 could deliver a quick, aggressive turn with repeated go loads without the same degree of coolant stress. Allied pilots who later read the German report would recognize the language but not the emphasis that Lurch gave to sustained load survival. Reactions among the German test pilots ranged from cautious admiration to strategic alarm. Hauptmann Otto Neumann watched the footage and said, "If we can force these aircraft into the wrong kind of fight, we can expose their weak points." Captain Reinhardt, less bloodthirsty, responded, "We do not need to destroy them to change their effectiveness. Forcing aborts by targeted fire at the oil cooler works." These exchanges would color tactical choices in the months following. On the Allied side, the intelligence intercepts noted an adjustment in tactics whereby German pilots emphasized high-energy attacks and aimed for radiator and oil cooler zones that Lurch had highlighted. The strategic impact widened in the weeks following. Reports from bomber groups indicated that escort losses in particular missions increased in variability and that adjustments were needed in how P-51 Mustangs escorted heavy bombers on long-range sorties. The German discovery did not produce instant victory, but it did cause Allied maintenance and training officers to reconsider. They looked into fuel metering redundancies, into structural reinforcements around the radiator openings, and into revised training emphasizing disengagement over risky defensive spirals. Tactical manuals were annotated, and a few squadrons reported minor retrofits that improved clutching in the fuel pump and added shielding in vulnerable radiator areas. The conversation about whether a fighter was defined by its speed or its capacity to endure repetitive combat turned into orders about training hours and new checklists for field repairs. There were human consequences as well. Hayes remained a prisoner for the near term. He was interrogated and later repatriated after the war events that would unfold. Lurch wrote a formal report that was translated and circulated among intelligence channels. He felt professional satisfaction mixed with a weighty disquiet. He had not set out to change doctrine, but to record observations. His report contained precise language about the Packard Merlin and maintenance windows, and a recommendation that commanders consider the vulnerability of cooling systems when designing interception tactics. The phrase that would cause the most ripple was a simple reconstruction in his log accessible to senior staff. The Mustang is fast. The Mustang is enduring in sprint, but it is not immune when asked to sustain defensive loads beyond design intent. 3 months later, the ripples had become a current. Operational changes included targeted training for Mustangs in fuel metering emergency procedures and altered escort patterns that emphasized altitude corridors where radiators and cooling penalties mattered less. Shipments of spare radiators and improved filter elements were prioritized to certain theaters. Engineers in factory lines began experimenting with additional cowling protection and updated pump diaphragms. The debate inside the aircraft design bureaus was vigorous. Some engineers argued for incremental reinforcement that would not significantly increase weight. Others cautioned that any added mass would reduce the very sprint speed that made the aircraft decisive. The strategic calculus remained contested and evolved slowly. 1 month after the test, the base logs show a shift. Pilots who had flown the Mustang noted operational advisories in their orders, and a memo distributed called for new emergency procedures. Lurch was invited to a closed session with air doctrine officers, and he summarized his conclusions. "We must weigh speed against survivability in sustained engagements," he said. The enemy design grants you speed, but not indefinite endurance under repeated high G-stress. At the 1-month mark, the Mustang remained a threat, but commanders were changing how they used it. At 3 months, the effect had spread. Escort formations were reordered to create relief points and alternate corridors that reduced the need for repeated close-in defense. Maintenance units received directives to inspect specific components after sorties that included negative G or impulsive maneuvers. A modest production change was authorized to reinforce radiator seals and adjust pump tolerances. Reports from forward units showed a decline in mission aborts attributed to cooling failures. The changes were not universal, and debates about production priorities continued in factories and staff rooms. At 6 months, the picture had matured into policy. Lurch's measured report was folded into a larger doctrinal paper on fighter escort. Manuals were appended with new emergency procedures and with warning markers on diagrams that matched the very numbers Lurch had annotated. The Mustang's reputation did not diminish. It adapted. Pilots were taught to use its sprint and to avoid unnecessary low-altitude completion of defensive spirals. In the archives, the flight report became a reference. It was read by commanders and engineers and cited in manual revisions. Lurch, who had always been a test pilot with a soft spot for precision, kept a copy of the annotated diagrams in his personal files. He would later say in a restrained interview that the truth about a machine is often less dramatic than the myths built around it, but more dangerous when ignored. The epilogue of human fates closed in different ways. Hayes survived the war and returned to aviation as a civilian instructor, telling students quietly about a morning when an engine failed and how decisions mattered more than heroism. Otto Keller went on to lead a maintenance team that specialized in adaptive repairs. Emil Bauer continued to refine diagrams and certifications for engine mounts and would later be called into advisory positions. Dr. Anna Weiss published a paper on cooling drag that referenced the practical case as an applied example of aerodynamic compromise. Colonel Kruger eventually retired from active service, arguing that intelligence was not a matter of who held a machine, but who understood the numbers. As for Hans Lurch, he remained a professional who refused public acclaim and preferred the solace of a well-calibrated instrument. His report on the Mustang appeared decades later in an archived file that students of aeronautical history would study. The final line of the official translated summary read in part, "This captured example demonstrates clear operational advantages when deployed for high-energy intercepts and an increased vulnerability when forced into prolonged tight combat. Commanders should instruct pilots to leverage energy states and avoid attritive engagements." When the dust settled, the revelation was not a sensational betrayal, but a technical truth with moral weight. Machines reveal limits, and those limits shape choices. The lessons gathered from that captured P-51 Mustang informed tactics and training, and remain an instruction about humility in design and doctrine. If this story surprised you and you want to discuss the technical detail that most fascinated you, leave a comment beginning with the words "the engine" if your question is about propulsion, or "the maneuver" if your question is about tactics. Your insights help guide future episodes in which we dive into diagrams, maintenance reports, and declassified flight logs. If you appreciate deep documented accounts that balance human experience with technical explanation, consider subscribing for more episodes where machines and decisions cross and sometimes change the course of events. Sometimes a single flight report does not only describe performance, it redirects strategy and rewrites expectations.